Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello and welcome back to our Building Better Boards and Leaders podcast series for part 2 of our episode discussing ESG insights, new risks, compliance and sustainability metrics that matter. I'm Susie Leask, partner in our corporate and commercial practice and co-host of the Building Better Boards and Leaders podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined again by partner Meg Lee from Hall & Wilcox and Debbie O'Byrne, founder of Planet Price. I want to go to Meg for a minute because I know there's lots happening in your space as well, flowing out of this, and there's absolutely no doubt, to Debbie's point, that this is an evolving area. We're seeing the law catch up, we're seeing the reporting and compliance catch up, we're working with lots of organisations who are leaders in this space and want to be doing better and more, not just because they're required to, and certainly I see this in the commercial contract world starting to flow down the supply chain. So even if you're not regulated yet, I think organisations might soon contractually be required to up their game, the same as they were required to up their game when work health and safety came in, and cyber and privacy and so on, in terms of emerging risks as those laws catch up. But Meg, what I want to ask you is around your insights on, perhaps if we flip it a little bit, on what not to do, or perhaps where organisations have got it wrong, because there have been some interesting cases in your area, and I heard one of your other podcasts as well that I wanted you to expand on a little bit. In your practice, which really impact the way in which boards need to give attention to and manage these ESG related risks.
Yeah, sure, Susie. Look, there's been a lot of interesting cases, obviously a lot of greenwashing cases, and regulator action in the area. So ASIC and ACCC putting out guidance. But yeah, one of the cases that I think is really interesting from a board perspective is, that personal liability piece, and the case that I think you're talking about was the case that Client Earth brought against the Shell directors.
Makes every director kind of get a bit nervous, right?
Yeah,
personal liability.
That's right. And look, they can rest easy slightly because the case was dismissed, and the Court of Appeal was refused an appeal on that. But I think a few interesting things arise from it, and I don't think directors can rest too easy. But a couple of interesting things that I take from it. The case was really well funded. Pension funds and various asset managers in the UK were interested to fund the case because they want to know, what the impacts are on their assets, and they want to hold companies account to make sure they are putting in place net zero plans. And so it was very well funded and a relatively sophisticated action. And the court did ultimately accept that Client Earth had established that there was a prima facie case that Shell does obviously face material and foreseeable risks as a result of climate change. And that won't be lost on Client Earth and on others seeking to bring ESG type claims. But nevertheless, the court found that the Shell directors did have a sufficient plan in place to reach net zero, and ultimately agreed with Shell's arguments, or the directors' arguments, that it's for the directors to decide how best to promote the success of the company. And what Client Earth didn't have sufficient evidence of was that the plan was so flawed as to mean the directors had failed to act in the company's best interests. So it was in part based on, and interesting again to ask Debbie's view on this, but it was in part based on the fact that the court didn't think that there was a universally accepted methodology for determining the means by which Shell should achieve its reduction targets. So essentially, they found that they'd done enough, they'd put in place a plan. The fact that Client Earth said it wasn't going to be enough to get to net zero couldn't be proven sufficiently for the case to proceed. So, look, I don't think it'll be the last of this kind of action.
I don't think so. And I guess, Meg, just from what you've said there, it sounds like they'll be watching. You've said it's good enough. Let's keep an eye on that and see, is it good enough? And I also think what's going to be challenging going forward is there's just been a massive backlash to offsets. So if you're meeting your obligations by this nebulous offset market, look what happened to Microsoft, one of the biggest companies in the world. Their offsets were proven to be, lots of house of cards, smoke and mirrors were a couple of the phrases I saw in the media. So I think there's a time frame within which that they won that case, but I certainly would not be resting on my laurels. And if my meeting my net zero target means purchasing, we'd have to put half the world under forestry to meet these offsets if everyone is going to rely on them. There just simply isn't enough, even with the great innovations happening with soil. There just isn't enough. And I do think that that will be an interesting space to watch, right? You've won your case, but now what? They'll just keep coming back around. And every year the climate events are getting worse, and billions of dollars in impacts to insurance companies. I'm really interested in watching what's happening with the insurance space. They're being targeted by Extinction Rebellion over the month of March, I think, because they're playing both sides. They're still supporting the expansion of fossil fuels, potentially not with direct funding or capital, but by insuring. And if you can't insure an oil exploration endeavor, then you can't pursue it. So I'm really keen to see where that insurance space will go. And fundamentally, they pay the bill. They're paying the bills for climate change. So what are we going to see? A continued retreat from insurance. I mean, we know there's this insurance retreat narrative is growing. So do we continue to allow fossil fuels to be funded and then tell communities who are, will never rebuild, well, we're not going to insure your new home, but we're still insuring the fossil fuel industry. So I think there's a particular challenge. Yeah, they're caught in the middle. And I don't think they can saddle that fence indefinitely. So I do think I agree with you, Meg, this is getting much more sophisticated. It's getting much more funding. We've seen divesting from fossil fuels, from pension funds, for, over a decade. This is an emerging risk for directors, and a growing risk, I think. So you've just got to keep your eye on what's ahead, not what's behind.
Yeah.
That's such good advice, Debbie. And I think as well, moving beyond that tick box compliance as well, from a board perspective, where historically they might have had that boardroom discussion of, oh, that's okay because we've got offset, thinking that was enough. I think this education piece is really critical, and it's part of how you discharge some of those duties that we talked about earlier. So before we wrap up,
to that, Susie, sorry.
we could talk about this all day.
There. I know. In terms of the business judgment rule, that gives some protection to directors, I think the better the data gets, and the more accessible that is, it just raises the bar on that test, because you have to have taken adequate steps to have informed yourself about the risks. Well, if the data's there and there's these great tools around, that onus is going to
shut your eyes to it.
Yeah, you can't.
I also think it helps, senior leadership and directors to say, listen, we've got more visibility and transparency now with these digital tools, so we have to do something. We have a responsibility to shareholders, but part of that is to be business savvy, and it is not business savvy based on the data we now see. Something that was invisible to us in the past is not invisible now. So it might look a little bit different from last year to this year, and these are the reasons why. This is what the data is showing us. We have an obligation to use that data to make good, informed, long-term business decisions for the best interests of everyone and the success of the business. So I do think the data might be a little bit confronting. We might need to pivot. We might need to shrink from that market and grow in that market. But that also gives them the mandate to take action, because it is good business practice.
So Debbie, we can hear that you're really passionate about this area, and it's clearly more to you than just your day job. Can you share us a little bit about what motivates you?
Sure. I've always been deeply passionate about sustainability, and one of my major trigger points is fairness, and this isn't fair. for these things to be happening to certain parts of the world, always watching what was happening in the Amazon. So I was always passionate about sustainability. And about over 10 years ago, I decided to go back to university, and people say to me, why did you not do an environmental science degree? And my view is this is not an environmental science problem. This is a business and human behavior problem that has environmental consequences. So I did an MBA, and the circular economy was my area, was my thesis. And I thought business has been such a positive force for change in the world, but it's blind to certain impacts of its business model. And I thought if I could understand the language of business, what the drivers, what the recipes of success look like, and then try to insert sustainability in a wider set of criteria to what does success look like. So I did my thesis, and that's where I actually discovered this whole notion of a circular economy, that it was much more holistic in its thinking. It was trying to regenerate, not just do less bad to the environment. It was we broke a few things along the way. How do we fix them? And that kind of led me to get deeply involved in circular economy work, circular economy consultancy work, did lots of really cool, projects with lots of great organizations. But that's where I was exposed to systems thinking. I had one of the, an amazing professor, Marianne van den Belt, who was part of the project that did the first ecosystem services report of the planet, years and years ago. And I learned about leverage points and tipping points and feedback loops, things that I knew nothing about before I studied her paper. And what that really brought home to me was this is a big system to change. It is like a big titanic gargantuan structure that has unfolded over a long period of time. And we've got to get into the nodes in the network that when you crank those nodes, they have an amplified effect on the system. So that's why I'm interested in data, decision making, accounting frameworks, and governance, because we can't fix every single organization individually, but if we can infiltrate the system with the measures and the metrics the system uses to measure success, then we could scale this really quickly. Because in the back of my mind, I have this clock ticking to 2030, and we've got to go faster. And you cannot go faster without digital tools, AI, and being a little bit braver. But how do we get directors to be braver? We need to be really clear about what you can and can't do and say based on your organization, what it's trying to do, what it seeks to do. So to me, fundamentally, one day I'm going to have to look at my grandkids in the face and tell them, when you knew, what did you do? And I have thrown everything in the kitchen sink at this, because I don't know how else to face that conversation. That's the conversation I'm preparing for. And I am definitely benefited from living in New Zealand, where we have a very deep, holistic Māori perspective. And a phrase that I learned from a colleague I worked with previously was makapuna decision making, which is decision making on behalf of our grandchildren. Really frustrates me when I hear that whiffing phase, what's in it for me? It's like, this is why we're in this mess. We've always thought about what's in it for me. What about what's in it for them? What is in it? How are we going to be good stewards of our economy, not just our planet, but our economy, with the challenges ahead, to give future generations things they need to flourish? And that's why I love what Wales has done. They're the first country to have I can't remember if it's a minister or a commissioner for future generations. And there is no doubt that has transformed the thinking in Wales. So they halted billions of dollars worth of roading infrastructure that was planned for, because there was no way that would be able to stay inside the carbon budget, just the carbon budget. So I do think I would love to see every board have somebody from a younger generation, preferably also an Indigenous member on their board. So we start to get
Different
We've
perspectives.
got so much short-term thinking in the way our economic system works, including how boards, I mean, what do boards watch? Share prices, annual reports. Look at the time frames involved in that system, when in fact the system that we've broken has feedback loops that are decades, hundreds, thousands of years. There's a mismatch between the kind of thinking required for this businesses to succeed in a system that works quite different timescales. So that's probably way too long of an answer. But you and I, Susie, we could talk about this forever.
Perhaps if we wrap up, it's been a fabulous conversation. Perhaps if you could each tell me just your top tip for boards, given this, situation they're faced with, the challenges of data, of reporting, and of making the world a better place for future generations. What's your top tip,
Where do we
Susie?
start?
Come talk to me and Susie.
That's a good tip. And look, I think I'd just kick off by saying this is very much a key risk that has to be on the board agenda. Full stop. It's, I keep saying ESG is not a trend. And I think as much as we just have to accept that and look at how we manage that risk, just like every other risk in the business. It's certainly accepted by our corporate governance experts and by legal opinion that climate and nature-related risks and dependencies, including all throughout the supply chain, are something that you have to consider and really understand as well and ask questions about, so that we can change the way in which we make decisions to consider those risks as well as part of our discharging of our duties of care and diligence as directors and boards. I think it's also really important to stay up to date. This is an evolving area. Yeah. It's fast moving. There's new legislation. I mean, we've just talked about climate today, but as Meg said, this is going to expand into nature and sustainability and even more. So even if you're not regulated yet in terms of mandatory reporting or compliance, the risks are there from a board perspective, and we expect those issues to be flowed down the supply chain. And the regulators are watching. That's the reality. The board, I think, as boards, as stakeholders, as business people, and our clients certainly need to be questioning proactively what is the organisation doing in this space. And this is an ASIC and ACCC compliance and enforcement priority, particularly around greenwashing. And we'll see lots of organisations that are very well intended and they're making some great aspirational statements and marketing materials, and unfortunately that's going to be a problem from a greenwashing perspective, which is where I think, Debbie, your data and certainly work that a lot of clients are doing to be accurate and authentic in this space will be really important.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think just start. You're going to have to dig in and look at the detail. And don't overcomplicate it. I mean, there's what would have taken when I've been a consultant in this space, 6 months of wrangling spreadsheets and emails and persuading people to give us data sets and lots of different things. It's much simpler now. So I would say just start. How do we start unpacking the challenges this might present? Look at the data you've already got and start there, and recognize that it's a journey. And I think you can tell a fair, authentic story around that journey if you're upfront and you're, like Susie said, it's data driven. I think that's the key one for me. Stop putting this off. Like Susie said, this is a fast moving feast, if you like, and start. You'll find out where you are from a maturity perspective, not just in your sustainability aspirations, but in your data. So if you start, no matter where you end up with it, every year you'll get better. And as the compliance bites more forcefully, we're working with clients who are not captured by TNFD yet, or they haven't signed up as one of the the proponents, but they're getting ready for it. They are getting their data ready for 2 or 3 years away when they will be required. So just start would be my key pointer.
That's great.
Fantastic advice. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. And a big thank you to Debbie O'Byrne and Meg Lee for joining us on our Building Better Boards and Leaders podcast. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or follow our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.